Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So we have officially reached the end of the decade. We've said goodbye to the 20 teens and now the 21st century has reached its 20s, kind of just like me, where it has to worry about career progression and maybe starting a mortgage or whatever. We're not here to talk about that today. We are going to be talking about the best films that came out during this decade, and it's going to be a celebration of these films. I'm not going to be structuring this video in the way that I usually do for my ranking videos. Instead, it's going to be an awards ceremony type video where each category is going to be a genre of film. Now, some of these genres are actual genres, but some of these have just been completely made up by me just so I can fit in as many films that I want to celebrate as possible. And speaking of wanting to fit in as many films as possible, because of this, I haven't done any overlapping. So each film that appears in this list and in their different categories only appear once, which made for an extra layer of trickiness. There were so many incredible films that were released this decade, but I decided to make it even harder for myself by restricting it to these categories. I initially thought about making a list of top 10 films of the decade, but there was just no way in hell that was going to happen. So instead we're doing this. Instead we're creating a whole ceremony to celebrate the cinema of the 20 teens. So without further ado, let's get into the first category, which is the best action film. And here are the nominees. First up, we have Captain America: The Winter Soldier, Mad Max: Fury Road, John Wick, Kingsman: The Secret Service, and Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol. Now, this was a super difficult list to come up with because this is a stacked category. I think some of the best action films of all time came from this decade. I think because they were able to utilize all the action films that have come before from all different countries around the world and utilize some of those techniques as well as newer techniques and different types of technology just to make the action feel so much more visceral and exciting and incredibly entertaining. So I think we have some of the best action films here listed, and it was such a hard pick for me. But the winner for this category is Kingsman: The Secret Service. Now, I haven't had a chance to discuss just how much I adore Kingsman: The Secret Service on this channel, but let this be the first occasion. I love this film. I think it's one of the best comic book movies to come out during this comic book movie renaissance that we're experiencing. It is so different. It injects this whole new element of excitement and ingenuity into the spy genre, and it's just so much more interesting than anything that any of the James Bond films have done in recent memory. I just think it invigorated this whole genre and made it so much more entertaining, so much more current. Of course, it's very British, but it's a very modern take on a British spy film, and you still have those antiquated elements there, but they've also been modernized to make it so much more enjoyable. I mean, Colin Firth in this film is incredible. And going back to the action element, you have the action sequence that takes place with Colin Firth in that church, and it is just endless entertainment. It was so cool, and the fact that it was Colin Firth was just mwah, perfect. I love this film. I think what makes this stand out for me against a John Wick or a Mission Impossible is the characters. Because whilst those films may have more impressive stunts and they feel bigger and have higher stakes, in the case of Kingsman, all of these characters are just so bomb and they're so badass that it just works so much more effectively as an overall world that you want to get back to. Whereas in John Wick's case, like, the premise is very simple. It's not really about the story surrounding John Wick. It's just about him beating up bad guys. So that's why I would pick Kingsman over the others. In the case of Captain America, I think it's really difficult because I love Captain America: The Winter Soldier. But the only thing that makes Kingsman stand out to me against Captain America 2 is the fact that it's much more of a standalone film. It works on its own from start to finish, whereas Captain America: The Winter Soldier, as the rest of the Marvel films tend to do, relies on the other films that preceded it. So it's so hard. I love every single one of these. I want to make that very clear, but my choice, my personal choice, is Kingsman. It's the reason why I slotted it into this category, because I knew that it would win. Our next category is the best animated film, and the nominees here are Coco, How to Train Your Dragon, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, The Lego Movie, and Zootopia. Now, this is another stacked category, and I think that animation is just improving purely because of the technology made available. I mean, the way that they're able to capture detail at this point is just incredible. If you look at some of the previous films in previous decades that we've gotten, the level of detail has never been as incredible as it is today. Having said that, there's also been kind of a sameness when it comes to the animation that we've gotten this decade. I think a lot of these films fall under the kind of general DreamWorks and Pixar umbrella, where nothing has really stood out as outstanding. And I think that is where these five come in. I think they truly have stood out to me personally. And here the award goes to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I cannot believe that I haven't chosen a Disney or a Pixar or even a DreamWorks film for best animated movie of this decade. But Spider-Verse is just so different. I mean, going back to what I said about that sameness, there is nothing that is formulaic about this film. They push the boundaries in animation at all levels when it comes to the story. I mean, just exploring the whole Spider-Man mythos in this one film that jumbles it all together, and somehow it works with all of these different characters, this different iteration of these characters. It works perfectly. And then you have the aspect of the actual animation, which is just so stylistically distinct and beautiful. It's so beautiful. Every single frame is a picture. It's magnificent. And then you have the added element of the soundtrack just being so authentic to Miles's character. Are you kidding? No, nothing else comes close. I'm sorry. I love these other films. And again, there are plenty of others that I could have put in this list as well. I think it perfectly captures the 2010s in the way that it represents the superhero movement, but at its peak, where there's ingenuity, where there's distinctness, where there's artistic, license. And I think that's why this film acts as the perfect representation for the best of animation this decade. Now for our next category, we're going to be diving into comedy. Now here's the thing, film is subjective, right? Whenever you're trying to assess a film and whenever you're trying to analyze it, it's always going to be dependent on different people's point of views. That is a given and it is inevitable. But when it comes to comedy, it's even more so, like more so than any other genre, because comedy and sense of humor is just so personal. But these films are here because I find them to be hilarious and because I think they are some of the best offerings that we got in the comedy genre this decade. I will say that it wasn't a shining decade for comedy, at least not in the cinema. I feel like this decade we definitely saw a lot more comedy films and smaller films kind of going directly to streaming or through TV series that became more and more personal and more specific. The broader comedy that we saw a lot of in the early noughties and the late 90s, I think kind of dissipated as people became more and more specific about what they wanted out of comedy. And I think that's more than justified, especially considering what I literally just said about how personal and subjective comedy can be. But as a result, I think the pool that I had to work with here was pretty small in comparison to what I had initially thought. So here are the nominees for Best Comedy: 21 Jump Street, Bridesmaids, Horrible Bosses, Spy, and What We Do in the Shadows. So again, like I said, I find all of these films really funny. I did want to particularly highlight What We Do in the Shadows because it is one of our very first offerings of Taika Waititi, who I think was a breakout star in the decade. It's so funny, but it's also very small and contained, and I love the tone of the film. It's very irreverent, but also it does have some morality in the center there. It's a bit murky, but Taika Waititi's character kind of acts as the most human-like vampire of them all, so you kind of attach yourself to him and he takes you on this weird, crazy, dark journey throughout the film, and I really did enjoy that. Again, I'm a big fan of all of these, really enjoyed What We Do in the Shadows, but my winner for best comedy of this decade is Spy. Now this stars Melissa McCarthy as this operative who works in an intelligence agency who doesn't really get the glory that a lot of the usual James Bond-like spies would. Here we have Jude Law portraying this type of James Bond character. He gets all the glory, he gets all the girls, he gets all of the attention, and Melissa McCarthy is just like obsessed with him and in love with him, or at least the idea of him. Also including Jason Statham, who's just the best here. Like, he is the best that he has ever been in Spy. He's so good. They're so good together. I love everyone in this film. I think it's really funny, but it's also really different in the way that it treats Melissa McCarthy's character. Like, it actually takes her seriously in a way that some of the other films that she starred in this decade really didn't. It balances between kind of making fun of her, kind of making fun of the fact that she's so downtrodden, but also giving her the opportunity to really shine, and so that you can really root for her by the end and she's a real badass. And I appreciated that about this film. Now, there are 2 Paul Feig nominees on my list here. I personally prefer Spy just a little bit, just because of that like action element, and because it's just so different a role for Melissa McCarthy. I think at the point that this film came out, her shtick started to feel a bit stale, and I just really liked how it shook things up a bit and gave her a lot more to do with her comedic chops. I'd highly recommend every single one of these films, and there are a ton more that didn't make it on my list that were super close, but I just had to dig deep and think of the film that just made me smile even just thinking of it, and that was definitely Spy. Right, so our next category is a tricky one because there weren't actually that many options. I was surprised to see, and this category is Best Family Film Live Action. So no animated films in this category whatsoever, and here the nominees are Aladdin, Paddington, Peter Rabbit, The Jungle Book, and The Karate Kid. So I think that's a pretty nice spread of family films that I got a chance to see. Starting off this decade with The Karate Kid, starring Jaden Smith and Jackie Chan. Listen, I've never been the biggest fan of the old Karate Kid. I didn't grow up around that time. So for me, this is my Karate Kid. And that might sound like blasphemy to a ton of you guys, but I love this. Oh, it's so underrated. Jaden Smith is so adorable. Oh, those were the good old days. And then you have Jackie Chan just being incredible as per usual. I think it was a case where if you caught it at the right time, like I would watch this film on repeat with my younger brothers, and we loved it because we were right at that age where we would definitely be more receptive to this film than someone who grew up loving maybe the 80s, I think, version of it. But the winner of this category is in fact Paddington, because are you kidding? Was there ever any doubt? What an incredible, adorable, wholesome, British, just phenomenal film. I love Paddington. I love the character of Paddington. I love the family that he is adopted by. I love the world of this film and how kind of Wes Anderson light it is. I think the second film definitely leans more towards Wes Anderson. But in the first film, it was just like a dash of whimsical and a dash of fancifulness. It's perfect. Like, what can you want? This is the epitome of a family film that happens to be live action. And I think it's just done so well. I also wanted to quickly mention that Jon Favreau's version of The Jungle Book is phenomenal. It's truly spectacular. I actually think this is one of the films that really did need to be experienced on the big screen to truly appreciate the majesty of the technological achievement that's on display here. Like, stunning. The only downside that I would say about this film is that in the last like 20 minutes, it kind of loses me. Like when we're dealing with the massive orangutan and we're dealing with this really weird rendition of I Want to Be Like You, it kind of loses me there. But other than that, I think it's a spectacular film. I think the actor who portrays Mowgli here was incredible. He was acting against nothing. He was acting against a blue/green screen or hall with a couple of sticks and Jon Favreau in his face pretending to be a jaguar. Like, that's it. He's so talented. I loved his performance here, and I think this is an incredible film. It just lost me in the last 20 minutes. Right, so the next category that we're going to be diving into is Best Drama. This was hard. Now, I've said that about every single category so far, but drama was difficult. So I've kind of cheated because I initially only wanted to have 5 films per category, but here I had 6. So here are the nominees: 12 Years a Slave, Moonlight, Room, The Help, The Imitation Game, and Whiplash. Okay, so I'm not going to do individual reviews for each and every one of these films. It would just take too long, but just know that I think each and every one of them is special, unique, life-changing, brilliant, wonderful, artful, all of it. All of the adjectives apply to all of these films. But my pick for the best drama of the decade is Moonlight. Now, this is highly controversial, I know, especially because of that iconic now moment at the Oscars where it was announced that actually Moonlight had won and not La La Land. I watched that live and I was so happy. I was so happy because this film is spectacular. The director, Barry Jenkins, just has some incredible artistic choices on display here. The cinematography is stunning. It's so beautiful. I love how he structures the story of this boy in 3 distinct chapters, and even though some of these elements bleed into one another because of course it's a lifespan, you're truly able to see how each distinct chapter in his life formed the man that we end up with at the very end of the film. And speaking of the character himself, I think he is brilliantly portrayed by the 3 actors. I especially enjoyed the first and the third actor who portrays him. I will again put the names down on the screen here to pay them their dues. I think the child actor is absolutely, like, are you kidding? I don't know if he was nominated. I don't think so, but he should have been nominated for an Oscar that year because he's incredible. He's largely mute, like you don't actually hear him speak a lot, but he's able to convey so many emotions and so many characteristics of this person through little dialogue at all. He's just incredible. And then he's acting against Mahershala Ali, who gives the performance of a lifetime, the performance of a decade. That baptism scene that happens in the beach is just like, it's striking, it's iconic. And it just reflects so many elements of Black culture that we don't typically see in film and in media in general. And the fact that this character that Mahershala portrays, who at first you think is hard and he's machismo and you don't think he's going to accept this little boy into his home, into his heart, he does so, and so openly that he provides this kid with a father figure for a split second to look up to. And it's just so touching, it's beautiful, it's just truly outstanding. And I know that there are a lot of butthurt fans out there that loved La La Land and were really upset that it didn't win, but I for one was ecstatic that this film won because it deserved the recognition, and because it was a smaller film, I think it definitely deserved the attention that it got for being a Best Picture winner. Next up we have Best Thriller. Now here's the thing, I'm not a huge fan of horror, so don't be expecting any horror categories in this list because I can't do it. I like my sleep, and if I watch a horror film, I won't be getting any. So I took the coward's way out and decided to do thriller instead of horror. And of course, they're 2 different things, but I definitely think that there is a little bit of overlap there where I could have included some horror films. I'm not going to, don't care, never mind, let's move on. But I also have to admit, the only reason why this category is even here is because of one particular film. And I think the minute that I say the film's name, you'll probably guess which one it is. But let's still go through the nominees. So here we have Black Swan, Get Out, Gone Girl, Joker, and Nocturnal Animals. So the winner is Get Out. No doubt about it. There was no real question there. I designed this whole list to accommodate Get Out and Black Swan, to be fair, because I couldn't find a way to include it in drama. So I just thought, let's put it in thriller. But it is definitely Get Out for me. This film changed everything. It changed the game for me. It changed the way that I see horror films. I didn't go and watch a ton of them afterwards, but I just appreciated what Jordan Peele was able to do with the genre. I do think that it's very light on horror, which is why it can kind of fit into the thriller genre pretty easily. But let's give some love to some of these other films. I think Black Swan is truly spectacular. It's a mind F of a film and it definitely dives into a lot of psychological issues that I love exploring. Gone Girl and Nocturnal Animals are also films that I found super interesting, and it's just different, and it has a creepy level to it that I really appreciated about those films. But in the case of Get Out, this is a film that just works on so many levels. This is a film that explores racial identity and racial discrimination in such a unique way. It really gets into the psychology of the issue. And one of the things that I really wanted to point out about this decade is the diversification of the representation of Black people within film. And that's something that we very much got a chance to see in this decade, I think more so than any other decade in cinema, which I really, really appreciated. And what a wonderful time to be alive. I think Get Out is a prime example of this, where you have a quote unquote Black film that belongs in the horror/thriller genre, and it works on both levels. It works as a film with social commentary that's based in race relations, but also as a horror/thriller film in its own right. And even though I had some issues with Us from this year, I did thoroughly enjoy it, but I do think that this is the superior film. And I think just because of the standard that it sets for him, I will always be interested to see what Jordan Peele works on next. For our next category, we're going to be diving into some romance. Yes, this is our best romance/rom-com movie of the decade award. And the nominees here are Crazy Rich Asians, Crazy Stupid Love, I Feel Pretty, Think Like a Man, and Warm Bodies. Okay, so I definitely think that much like comedies, rom-coms and romance films definitely saw a bit of a decline this decade, especially in the latter half, and especially because streaming and TV shows, you know, they've just become so much more specific. You know, you can find a specific type of rom-com that you can connect to so much more easily these days because there are so many more options on the smaller screen. So I think it does make sense that a lot of these rom-coms weren't as viewed in the cinema anymore because there's just so many more options on streaming and online. Having said that, I do think this is a decent selection of some of the best rom-coms that we got of this decade, but I'm not overly passionate, to be honest. I think in the first half of this decade I was definitely more into rom-coms than I am now, but still I did want to highlight this genre because I think it's often overlooked, especially by male critics, and we ain't doing that around here. I did make the difficult decision of including I Feel Pretty over Isn't It Romantic, and I think these two films are so similar, but I chose the one that stars Amy Schumer somewhat, I guess, controversially, because the world decided that it just hates Amy Schumer for some reason. And I kind of know the reasons why, but I do think she warrants the amount of hatred that is targeted towards her. But I digress. I really enjoyed I Feel Pretty. I thought it was a really fun time in the cinema. It had all of the typical rom-com conventions that are to be expected at this point, but it did them really well. I think it was a much more refreshing take on a rom-com, especially because of the whole weight issue. I like how they didn't just treat her as a laughable fat character. She has insecurities, but she's still a human being with emotions and feelings. Like, imagine that. Whereas I feel like Rebel Wilson has just coasted so much on the fat jokes in her career that it kind of just turns me off of her. And I don't think that Isn't It Romantic was anywhere near as heartwarming and actually genuine as I Feel Pretty. So I put I Feel Pretty up here over Isn't It Romantic, but it still didn't win because the winner of this category is Crazy Stupid Love. What a fantastic rom-com. None of these other rom-coms have come close to the hilarity, but also the ingenuity and the cleverness, the excellent writing of Crazy Stupid Love. It's such a breath of fresh air in this genre, and it really stands on its own. It's dealing with the relationship between Ryan Gosling and Emma Stone, who have excellent chemistry in this film, and that's the more typical relationship that you see in a rom-com. But then you also have Steve Carell and Julianne Moore going through that divorce, going through a breakup, and that's kind of in the background. But then you have the bromance between Ryan Gosling and Steve Carell, which is just, it's the best part of the whole film, and I think it just makes it so much more interesting, so much more dynamic. The film has hilarious moments in it, and so often rom-coms are heavy on the rom, not so heavy on the com. I think this definitely has both in equal measure, and that's why to me it stands out above the crowd for the offerings that we had this decade. For our next category, I've done a little bit more cheating. I've melded together two separate genres because these aren't really the genres that I'm attracted to the most, and so out of the pool of films, I definitely found it easier to just draw upon both different subgenres. So here we have the best fantasy/sci-fi movie, and the nominees here are A Monster Calls, Arrival, Ex Machina, Inception, Snowpiercer, and The Martian. So talk about another stacked category. I mean, we have some of the best sci-fi slash fantasy films to have ever come out ever, let alone just in this decade. So it's a tough one. First off, just want to say Arrival, phenomenal film, so beautiful and stylistic and different, an entirely different interpretation of an alien invasion film, and I very much appreciated the practical aspect of it, the exploration of what you would actually do. What would the world's actual reaction to an alien invasion be? It's just so clever and very distinct. It really stood out to me the year that it came out. And another film that really stayed with me and I thought was just truly stunning and visually spectacular, but also thematically just incredibly touching, was A Monster Calls. I think this film was so grossly overlooked. Like, I'm embarrassed for everyone who has not seen this film because it is truly spectacular. I love the exploration of deeper themes and the way that it manifests in these kind of cartoons or illustrations that are just visually striking. Like I said, I love Felicity's performance in this film. I think she was great in here. The child actor in this film as well was also phenomenal. It's just such a beautiful film that was so overlooked. It pains me how overlooked this film was, but it's stunning. Just check out A Monster Calls. If I had an hour to talk about each film on this category, then we could really get into it. I mean, Ex Machina, Snowpiercer, The Martian, fantastic. They're all brilliant. I love Snowpiercer in particular because of the layers of social commentary, which I very much enjoy, as you can probably tell from my love of Get Out. But number one, the winner, is of course Inception. There was never any real doubt here, because what Christopher Nolan does with Inception is set the standard. He sets the standard, whether it's intentional or not, for the films of this decade, because there are definitely so many films out there that took inspiration from Inception and just ran with it, and it created a whole mood for a lot of the blockbusters that we saw this decade. I'm looking at you, Doctor Strange. Everyone is incredible in this film, including Leonardo DiCaprio, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and of course Helen Page. And then you have the incredible practical effect of the hallway sequence, which is just legendary. It's phenomenal. Again, I'm looking at you, Doctor Strange. And then you have the concept itself. Like, this is a high concept film and it really stays with you. The whole idea of incepting an idea into someone's brain is something that you can apply to a range of things like media, propaganda, film. It's just something that's really interesting and engages the audience and asks you to ask a ton of questions about the things that are incepted into your own mind. So I of course enjoyed Inception. I think it is one of those films that will go down in history as being highly influential, especially for this decade. The next category is one that I have quaintly named The Black Experience. Now, this is just a category dedicated towards celebrating Black films. Now, like I said earlier, I really recognize and appreciate the fact that this decade saw the diversification of the representation of Black people and Black characters. We got so many different types of Black stories being told on the big screen, and that is incredible. And of course, I still very much believe that stories about slavery and about the civil rights movement in America and about the subjugation and the oppression of Black people around the world, but also in particular America, are important to tell. I don't think we should stop telling them in the slightest. I think we should keep telling these stories, but I also don't think they should be the only types of stories that we see in Black cinema. I think this whole diversity of storytelling that we're seeing within the Black community, within Black filmmaking community, is excellent, and it's something that I'm so optimistic and so excited about. So here are some of the best films that I saw this decade that fall into this category, but keep in mind that there are tons of films that I could have put here that are absent, just like with the other categories. But in the case here specifically, I did try to make this category as diverse and as representative of the decade as possible. So here are the nominees: Black Klansman, Black Panther, Dolomite Is My Name, Fruitvale Station, Hidden Figures, and Sorry to Bother You. So this to me was as diverse and well-rounded as I could possibly make this list. I already talked at length about the adoration that I have for Black Panther in my best movies of 2018 video, so we're not going to dive into it in too much detail here. I just think the film is iconic, and I think it garnered a huge movement in the Black community and beyond, and just the comic book movie loving community around the world. And I think it is something that really stands out to me within the decade. And of course, the film itself itself is brilliant. Like I said, I already have a review. We're moving on here. There are also a couple of other nominees on this list that make my best movies of 2018 list in BlacKkKlansman and Sorry to Bother You. Again, I talk about them in more detail in that video, so check out that video if you want to hear my thoughts on those films. And I also did a best movies of 2019 list, which, spoiler alert, Dolomite Is My Name makes an appearance in as well. So check out that video if you want to hear my thoughts on Dolomite Is My Name. My winner for this category is Hidden Figures. I love this film because it portrays something that we barely ever see when it comes to Black cinema, and that is powerful, intelligent, determined Black women making huge strides in history. They face so many barriers and so many boundaries to achieving their goals, and it was just such a struggle for them to be able to excel in the field that they had worked so hard to get to in the first place. Something as small as being able to access a bathroom is just made so much harder for them, and it stops their ability to excel in the job that they are hired to do in the first place, especially in the case of Taraji P. Henson's character. And the portrayal of these three very real women by Taraji P. Henson and Janelle Monáe and Octavia Spencer is just fantastic because they have a kinship together. They have a relationship that is just so endearing and enduring. And also you have this incredible soundtrack by Pharrell, which is just, again, it brings up the mood of the film. So as a result, the film never feels too depressing. It doesn't feel too preachy or too dour. There's an optimism to it that underlines everything, and I think that's what makes it really stand out. So our next and penultimate category is Best Underrated Movies. Now these are films that I think were truly brilliant but also overlooked. So the nominees here are Bad Times at the El Royale, Megamind, Mudbound, Saving Mr. Banks, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and The Nice Guys. So I think that's a pretty stacked category of films that haven't really stood the test of time as well as they should have, in my opinion. I definitely think that Bad Times at the El Royale and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and The Nice Guys were all casualties of the change in trends when it came to streaming. You know, I think a lot more people may have discovered these films in streaming as opposed to seeing them in the cinema. And I definitely think that perhaps 20 years ago they would have done a bit better in the cinema because people would have seen them there and they would have been much more event viewing worthy. But just in the landscape that we're dealing with today, perhaps a lot of people dismiss these films as streaming films as opposed to spectacles that they really want to see in the cinema as a matter of urgency. And speaking of streaming, in the case of Mudbound, I think this film was overlooked because it's a Netflix movie and it came out at a time when Netflix didn't really have a stronghold within prestige filmmaking quite yet. So a lot of people may have dismissed this film, but it's actually so good, and I highly recommend you check it out amongst the plethora of offerings that is available on Netflix. Just kind of sift through all of that stuff and really find this nugget of gold. I highly recommend it. And finally, in the case of Megamind, I think this is one of the most underrated DreamWorks films ever, and I think it's because this film was so ahead of its time. It came out in 2010 when we didn't really have that comic book movie renaissance quite yet. I think if it had come out now, or actually maybe not now because we're starting to see a little bit of superhero fatigue at this point, but if it had come out in that prime time of 2016 to 2018, I think this film would have gotten a much more positive response than it did when it came out at first. I think it was relatively successful, but it really wasn't the crowning jewel that it deserves to be within the DreamWorks lineup. My choice for this category for most underrated film is actually The Man from U.N.C.L.E. because for some reason a lot of people have written off Guy Ritchie. I actually think he is one of the best auteur directors working today, not because his films are incredible and Oscar worthy or anything like that, but because he's always trying something new. He's always doing some different things with different genres of film. I love the way that he develops character dynamics. I think the peak example of this is actually The Gentleman, but the peak example of this before The Gentleman came out was The Man from U.N.C.L.E. because I loved the dynamic between Henry Cavill and Armie Hammer in this film. They are fantastic. Alicia Vikander and Elizabeth Debicki are also here, and they're great. They're great female characters, especially for Guy Ritchie, who doesn't really excel in writing female characters. This film is just so stylish. It does such a great job of bringing the 60s to life with its soundtrack, its visuals, its cinematography, the costume design, like everything. It's beautiful, and also in the plot itself, it's very 60s, it's very retro in that way. I absolutely love this film, and I was gutted that it didn't get the attention that it deserved, in my opinion. I definitely think it was the Nice Guys of its year. I actually think it came out a year before The Nice Guys, so 2 years in a row we had these underrated films with these incredible actors giving wonderful performances that just went completely ignored. My final category is foolhardy. It is a pointless endeavor that will not bring about any satisfaction no matter how I look at the situation. But I would be remiss if I did not mention one of the most influential, one of the most iconic genres of film of this decade by far. This genre of film was huge this decade. It pretty much defined this decade of film. So of course I'm gonna have to dive into it, even though I know either way I'm not satisfied with this list either, just to let you know. Of course I am talking about the best comic book movies, and the nominees are Avengers Endgame, Deadpool, Guardians of the Galaxy, The Avengers, Thor Ragnarok, and Wonder Woman. So I tried to make this list as diverse as possible and tried to include as many different franchises within the comic book movie genre as possible. Again, keeping in mind that I could only mention the films that I haven't put in other categories yet in this list. And there are some films that I did want to include purely because I wanted a bit more diversity, like Kick-Ass and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. But it really doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the winner is The Avengers. Now, this isn't the best MCU film by a long shot. I think they have improved their film so much since the first Avengers came out. But that's the thing, it's the first Avengers. All of these Avengers films wouldn't have happened without the original film that set the tone for so many of the MCU films, but also just comic book movies in general. This film is a defining moment in cinematic history within the last 10 years. So I definitely think it's highly deserving of a position in this list of the best movies of the decade. Even if it's not the best version of an Avengers movie, it's still an excellent film in its own right. It stands alone. It stands on its own so well. I can tell because I watched it first and I had no idea about the characters that were involved in this film and comic books and anything of the sort. I still think it deserves a level of respect and a level of prestige that is just a little bit above the rest, just for being the first one that brought all of these different elements, all of these different characters, story arcs, character development arcs together. And it did it so well and so effectively that in Avengers Endgame, we ended up going back to the first Avengers film. We didn't go back to Age of Ultron. This film is the point of origin for a lot of what we see in the MCU today. And I think a lot of the character dynamics that we know and love with the core Avengers were set up in this film so well that they have endured. So that's it from me. Now that I've told you guys what my thoughts are on the best movies of the decade, like I said, each and every one of these films that I listed here today are just creme de la creme, on a different level in my opinion. But I had to choose one in each category. But I kind of already cheated by creating categories where I listed several films in each genre anyway, so I had to pick one. But let me know what your thoughts are on some of the best movies of the decade down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!